Alright, so today we're going to explore a little bit about India ink techniques. So we are going to need a little bit of India ink, a palette, water, a paintbrush, and our little worksheet. I printed mine on watercolor paper just so the water that I'm going to use is not going to mess the paper up and make it all wrinkly. So we are going to get started at the top of our worksheet with our little value scale. So I'm going to open my India ink. I am going to grab my brush and we're going to go from dark to light. So make sure you just start with your pure India ink. So we're not going to add any water to it. And we are going to start filling in our first square of our value scale. I'm using a smaller brush. I'm making sure I'm staying within the lines, and I'm working slowly just to make sure that I fill in that whole little square. So I am then going to put my brush in the water, and what we're going to be doing is we are not going to move on to the next square right away because we need that square to dry a little bit. If we were to start on that second square right away, our color might bleed into the second square a little bit and make a little bit of a mess. So we're going to then start on our wet on wet. So what I'm using is using a clean brush and just putting some water on my section for the wet on wet. So wet on wet is applying ink onto wet paper for soft blurry edges. So as you can see, we're putting the water down. We are going to then grab some India ink and we're gonna just doodle over it, just create some lines just to experiment and see how that is going to look. So as you can see, the lines are kind of like bleeding into the water. They're becoming a little bit messier, and that is going to be our wet on wet. We can then move on to our next square of our value scale. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to grab some of that pure India ink and we're going to put it on our little palette just a little bit just to get started. And then what I'm going to do is grab some water and add it to it. Not a lot, just enough to just dilute it a little bit. And we are going to fill in our second square of our value scale. And it's still going to look pretty dark. When it dries, is going to be a little bit lighter, and you will see. But you can already kind of see the difference between the darkest and the lightest one. So as you can see, there's a little bit of a glare onto that square. That means it's still wet. So we're just going to move on to our next thing. So the next thing we're going to be working on is going to be our water drop. So as we did before, we are just going to wet down that area, make sure it's all nice and wet, and then we are basically just going to grab one little drop of ink and drop it onto this, and we're just going to see that the ink is going to spread in an organic shape, and that's how you do it. Okay, so when it dries, you're going to see it's going to dry a little bit differently, and you can add more water to it, you can just add more ink, you can just play around with dropping water into this area. We are then going to move on to our layered section. So what we're going to be doing is just use very, very diluted light wash. So a little bit of ink and more water. And we are going to fill that whole area in. So make sure you use a lot of water. And we're just going to start with the first layer. So what we're going to be doing after that is we're going to let it dry. We're going to make sure that it dries evenly, and then we are going to add more layers to it just to darken that area up. So as you can see, I'm spreading my very diluted ink. It looks very light. So just make sure that you spread it nicely, that it looks even, that it looks nice. And then we will just let it dry. So filling in that area means we're giving it a wash. While that dries, we can move back up to our value scale. So we are going to use that already pre-diluted ink that we used for our second square, and we're going to be adding some more water to it. We're going to mix it up and fill in our third square of our value scale. So this is going to be our medium value. So just make sure you add the water, and then you can start filling it in, being careful at the same time not to put your hand over our layered area or a water drop or anything else that's still drying. And you can see that it's still drying because it still looks very bright. While that dries, we can move back down to our even wash, which is basically what we just did for our layered area. So for that one, we don't want to see areas that are darker. We just want to see a very even, smooth layer. So just make sure you use watered down ink and make sure you make it very nice and easy and smooth. So this one should go by pretty quickly. While that dries, we're going to move back to our layered area again. We're going to use the same diluted color, and we're just going to add one layer of that very diluted color we just used for the layered one on top of a certain area of our layered. So we want to still see our lightest value, but we also want to see that we can darken it up. Okay, so just make sure you go over a different area. You can do it in thirds. I want to add one more layer, so that's kind of how I'm doing it, and then I'm going to let that dry as well. And our value scale is still drying, so we're going to move on to our wet on dry. So we're just going to put some India ink on our brush and just doodle on very dry paper. So this is not going to be wet. The edges are going to look sharper, and it is not going to bleed like it did on the wet on wet. So with this technique, you can just make very sharp, controlled lines. Moving back up to our value scale again, we are just going to make sure that we dilute that ink that we use for mid-tone a little bit more, and then we are going to start painting it in our fourth square. It's going to look lighter, it's going to look more diluted, and we're going to make sure we try to stay to the best of our abilities within those lines. And then checking my layered one again, make sure it's dry so I can add my last layer, and as you can see, it's going to get even darker than before. So we're using the same amount of ink and water for this one that we use for all the layers, just adding more and more on top of each other is going to make it darker. We are then moving on to our dry on dry. So what I'm going to do is use a paper towel to dry my brush, put a little ink on it, dry it a little bit more, and then create some lines. So as you can see, these lines are going to be rougher and they're going to have more texture marks throughout them, and that's going to be our dry on dry. Moving back up to our value scale, we're going to dilute that ink a little bit more for the last time, and we are going to fill in the last square of our value scale. So just make sure you fill it in nicely, and we're going to let that dry as well. So for our gradient, what I like to do is start with that pure India ink, and then we are just going to get water and basically pull that color down all the way down, but keep adding more and more water. So at the beginning, it's going to look a little bit splotchy. We're just going to keep adding water, pulling that ink, and just blending it in nicely. So you can just keep grabbing that darker tone and pull it down, but then I usually just grab a little bit more of the India ink, pull it down some more, and make sure that it all looks nice and blended. So that's how you do it. Just make sure you let it dry, and then we're done. Great job on this worksheet.